Protectionism, why tariffs and trade wars might very well be the new normal. That's what we're talking about at length in this episode of The Business of Agriculture. Are you looking for productive efficiencies in growing higher yielding, better performing crops? New Fields Ag provides a complete portfolio of biological products focused on you, the farmer. Visit newfieldsag.com for more information to help you farm better. Hey there, welcome to another fantastic episode of The Business of Agriculture. Got a great one for you today. I got a great guest. He's a friend of show. He's my cohort on the Business of Ag Success Group. His name is Todd Thurman. He runs a company called Swine Insights. He's a livestock consultant, international agricultural consultant, and thinker. And he's been on my show a number of times because we have a lot of out there ideas. I think if you pay attention to the show, you know that I'm not afraid to bring up something that a lot of people are not talking about. And what we discover is oftentimes a year and 2 and 3 years after we talk about it here, it becomes more of a mainstream discussion. One of those principally being demographics. The other one that now I'm hearing more people discuss is the reality of oversupply. Back when we were still selling $7 corn, I talked about the reality of oversupply. Now that's a discussion. Now we're going to talk about something that nobody's really getting into. Yes, we know that tariffs are a daily discussion, especially in agriculture, where we are an export-driven economy here in the United States and in Canada. We also know that the trade spat is kind of a new thing because we didn't have that under the prior administration. But here's the thing. I believe I can make the case, and I will in this episode, that trade wars and tariffs are the new normal. We will be having this discussion 1 year, 3 year, 5 years, 7 years, to where all of a sudden it becomes just like subsidies for crop insurance or other things that have become ubiquitous, and then all of a sudden the norm in agriculture. This will be the norm in agriculture. Tariffs, trade wars, and trade spats. Why? Because of protectionism. Countries are going to buckle down and protect and foster their own industries. Todd and I are going to get into the reasons why this is happening. We're also going to give you a couple of ideas, maybe why it won't happen, but in general, we both are on the same agreement, same card, if you will, that tariffs, trade wars, and protectionism, along with then deglobalization, which is actually going to be a consequence of these things, is here to stay. Mr. Thurman.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good summary of kind of what we've been talking about, and I think it kind of comes back to stuff that we've talked about before that I talk about a lot, and that is what were the drivers of kind of our normal, what we grew up in terms of agriculture, and what drove that narrative of, feed the world or more, however you want to describe that. And those three things are really demographic growth, so population growth, rapid population growth. Yep. Second, rapid economic expansion that coincided with that population growth, and globalism. So those three things were the real drivers. It was more mouths to feed, more resources in individuals' hands so that they could eat both more food and more high quality food. And then third, the globalization piece, which was obviously a huge one for everybody, but particularly for North America, was, all of a sudden we had a whole new group of potential customers available to us. So those were the three primary drivers. And we've been discussing recently, all three of them are changing in pretty dramatic ways, or at least maybe changing in pretty dramatic ways.
So let's just go ahead and the person that might be tuning into this episode of the Business of Agriculture, and by the way, you can hear it on everywhere you get audio podcasts. You also, I would like you to go to my YouTube channel. We're really trying to boost that. Go to the Damian Mason channel, go on YouTube, type in Damian Mason, hit subscribe. It costs you nothing. I really want to grow this. So more people, then the more I have following, the more then people will get this, and they'll hear brilliant agricultural commentary. And also you can check it out on Acres TV. Population, for the person that hasn't tuned into our stuff before, the average person still believes that somehow we're going to hit 9.7 billion people, or we're going to have 11 billion people, a high variant model that the United Nations has been telling everybody, from my nuns and catechism to the United Nations to Paul Ehricks, or whatever the hell his name is, the professor from Stanford who wrote the book in 1968, that population bomb. You've been told forever and ever we're going to overpopulate. It's not true. It's not happening. And in fact, population growth is dropping like a rock. We're still growing just a little bit, but fertility rates are truly falling off the cliff. South Korea, 0.8% fertility rate. The United States of America doubled that at 1.6. Guess what? Even at 1.6, we're still 25% below replacement rate. It takes 2.1 babies per female for your population to remain constant. We are 25% off of that. Almost all of the world, except for maybe about a dozen countries, fundamentally Islamic countries, most of them, and they're not even that great of population, are in this situation. Population will not continue to grow. So that is why we will see a slowdown in economic expansion, because more mouths to feed, more people that need houses, more people need cars, TVs, more people doing work. That has fostered the expansion of the global economy from about 1 billion people on the planet in the year 1900 to 8 billion today. Well, guess what? We're not going to go from 1 to 8 billion, then from 8 to 9 billion, or 8 to 11, or 8 to 17 billion, which will be the same type of growth ever again. It's not happening. So the population is not going to continue to grow, which means that right there, we have an entire economy, Todd, that is predicated on more people tomorrow than were there today. Our Social Security is predicated on that. Our growth and economic expansion. We talk about housing starts in the United States. All of that is predicated on more people tomorrow than there were yesterday.
And for good reason. I mean, that's the way it's been forever.
Hundreds of years.
That, you go back, we always go back to 1500 is kind of when we have decent records in terms of estimating the global population. And, for the vast majority of those 400 years between 1500 and 1900, it was slow, steady growth. And certainly you had some setbacks there with, famines and various calamities, but overall you had very slow, from our perspective, very slow, steady growth for about 400 years, and then that really exploded around the turn of the 20th century, and you had
mostly because
increase.
Mostly because in the last 125 years, since the year 1900. Wars became the only way we got rid of population. Up until then, you could count on about a good plague every 50 years, every 50 to 100 years, that would legit wipe out 1/3 of the population. That's a true story historically.
Right, but it came back very quickly because fertility rates were always really high, and so
like sea turtles. If you think you're going to lose half of your offspring, you have 7 kids because you hope that 3 might make it, and that's exactly what happened for millennia until really about the last century.
Right, and what seems normal to us is sort of the hangover of those higher fertility rates, but mortality rates, particularly infant and childhood mortality rates, went down dramatically after the turn of the century. And so what we had was sort of that transition period where people were living much longer, and fertility rates remained high. Now we're in that phase where fertility rates have declined significantly. The mortality rate, so life expectancies, have kind of leveled out, still increasing globally, but at a much slower pace. And so what we see now is a beginning of that transition into a declining population. So we have about 1/3 of the global population lives in a country that is already declining. And then everywhere else,
by the way, the person listening to this, he doesn't mean declining as in its morals. He doesn't mean declining in its societal art appreciation. He means declining declining in its fertility rates and its birth rates, and it could be declining in its artful expression as well. But yes,
So actual 30% of the population globally today lives in a country that is actually experiencing population decline now, meaning there's fewer people in the country this year than there was last year, and there'll be even fewer people next year. That includes some massively important countries like China, for example.
Yep.
And then pretty much the rest of the world is at or below replacement rate on fertility, with a few notable exceptions, almost exclusively in the Middle East and Africa. And so basically where we're at right now is really right in the middle of a transition period where global population is slowing dramatically. I think it peaked, I can't remember the exact year, it was in the 60s. It peaked at around a little over 2% per year.
Yep.
And right now globally we're at less than 0.9%, and that's going to decline pretty rapidly. So
I want to go ahead here real quickly because the person listening says, Damian, you opened the show saying are tariffs and trade wars the new normal, and you said it will be because of protectionism and deglobalization. Now you're talking about population. So let's just go ahead and bring it right back to the actual subject. Why population decline is directly related to tariffs and trade wars. I'll make it very simple. If population was the number one driver, population growth was the number one driver of global economics, again, more mouths to feed, you need more houses, you need more cars, you need more television, every consumer good. More people doing work, more people contributing to the economy. When that changes, there is pressure then on governments to protect the declining population's standard of living. Okay, Hungary is a country of, I think, like 7 million is roughly the population there. They have a declining population. Hungary hunkers down. Hungary has been very resistant to bringing in migrants. It's one of the few European countries doing that. Hungary has had some the media would call it right-wing leadership. But one thing that happens in countries like this is the populace that is there says, you know what? We might be declining population, and by God, we got to protect ourselves. And so protectionism is called for and sets in very promptly in these sorts of situations because you don't want to give up what you have. In other words, you got $100,000 in the bank. Are you ready and excited to give that away? No, because you feel like you've earned it. You've gotten comfortable there. This is why there are calls for protectionism, meaning close the borders. Let's keep imported goods out of here. Let's keep jobs at home. And that's why population decrease pushes protectionism. That's been there. There are historical cases. I just gave some in places like some of the European countries. You could make the point that Europe, most all of Europe, is in a declining population situation and is the continent with the longest track record of declining population. Like there was fertility rates hovering around 1.2, 1.4 in Western Europe in the 80s and 90s. Okay, we didn't get there until after that. And what has Europe generally been? Protectionist. They were anti-grain from places like the United States, and they tried to say it was because of GMOs, which was all a bunch of bullshit. They used the safety of GMOs as a reason to protect their own producers and agricultural entities. They've used environmental reasons to resist imports of foreign automobiles. Why? Because Germany in particular, France and Italy and England to a lesser extent, have huge automobile sectors. So they used the false facade of environmentalism or food safety to protect some of their own native industries, agriculture and automotives being two great examples. I think that's a really good, solid example if you want to spin off of that.
Yeah, for sure. I would pick just a little bit. I think it's a reasonable assumption that if populations decline, it's going to be at least more difficult to grow the economy at the same pace that we've grown accustomed to in our normal. Yep. But we don't really have any historical perspective for a long-term decline. So nobody really knows for sure that the economy is necessarily, or economic growth is necessarily going to slow along with population growth. I think it's a reasonable assumption given the fact that historically they've been heavily correlated, right? Very highly correlated.
Yep.
But we know that correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation. And so there is, some people will argue that, hey, there's ways that we can continue to grow the economy, even in a demographic decline. But I think I'm very comfortable saying it's going to be much more difficult to do that. And I think our expectations are going to have to.
So you understood why I interjected, because I was thinking like the listener, and it's probably saying, well, just because population declines doesn't directly then equal tariffs and trade spats. It does, and again, it's part of it is theory, but part of it is actual proof. Using Europe, I think, is the best example. Europe has been the most protectionist of any of the global economy blocks, if you will, really going back since the night about the time that we really became we've been globalized. You can say post-World War II, but I really think it goes to about the 80s, when Japan became the juggernaut, when Japan became the globe's number 2 economy. Yes, they were in the 1980s. Look it up. And if you were from a manufacturing area like me, Todd, I remember driving down blue collar streets in Huntington, Indiana, where those people lost their factory jobs and they had bumper stickers that said unemployment made in Japan, because that's the first time where we started seeing all sorts of consumer goods, from VCRs to TVs, basically all electronics made in Japan. And what was there a call for? And I'm going back 40 plus years ago, going back to the early 80s. We were in a recession. We had stagflation. I know this is historical data for a lot of you that listen to this. Ronald Reagan comes into office, inherits 18% interest. That's a true story. Land rates, if you wanted to buy a mortgage, you had 18 to 21% mortgage. We were losing our industrial sector to globalization, and it was sold as this is a good thing because now you can go in the JCPenney Christmas catalog, or what became then the Walmart shopper, and you can buy cheap crap that was manufactured overseas. Japan was first. China came after that. But there were calls for protectionism. Honestly, it didn't work. That's the thing. The United States didn't become tariff-oriented and protectionist. Again, good for cheap manufactured goods, very bad for the manufacturing sector, though, in places like the Rust Belt where I was raised.
Yeah, so it's more than reasonable to expect that with what we're seeing with those trends today, based on some historical examples, especially around globalization, that's probably the direction we're going. How long that lasts, how deeply that becomes entrenched, I think is an open question. But I think the fact that we're moving in that direction seems almost obvious at this point.
I want to get into the political aspect of it, because there's going to be somebody that's listening to this says, well, this is only a Trump thing. And I would say, well, was Trump in charge of the entire European Union from the 90s on when they became protectionist and slapped up huge tariffs? And you've got some information about this. Was Trump president in the 1930s when we thought we would answer the, or 20s, when we thought we would answer the threat of globalization 100 years ago with tariff trade? No. So this is got a longer history and longer tail. I want to remind you about my new sponsor here, Harvest Returns. If you are funding your farm, your ranch, your agribusiness, it does not have to be hard. Your operation is unique, so why should you try to fit a square peg into a round hole with one-size-fits-all ag credit? Harvest Returns is here to help. They understand that every agribusiness is different, with a pool of over 18,000 investors. That's right. Harvest Returns gets money from investors and then makes it available to agricultural producers. You can get this money from these investors. You can do creative financing options. This is not your standard go to the ag lender and get yourself a 30-year loan. We're talking about creative agricultural solutions, what might be more important now in the ag sector's economy situation that we are right now than ever. Harvest Returns can bring the capital you need to reach your goals. Go to harvestreturns.com, www.harvestreturns.com. All right. We've got a history of this. And even though we had the population growth, when there are economic downturns, calls then go straight to put up trade barriers. Let's protect our own native-born and native industry. Steel has had tariffs and trade, and countries have subsidized steel. I think it's right up there with agriculture in terms of how it gets used as a bargaining chip, as a lightning rod. And this goes back a while. Give a little history on the tariff thing, as it usually has been associated with when there's economic concern or jitters, the call for protectionism is one of the first calls.
Yeah, so I think maybe one of the best examples that probably gets overused a little bit, but I think is really relevant. It goes back to the 30s, and so we're coming out of the 1920s, and obviously we have the stock market crash in 1929 in the U.S., and that brought up an idea around raising tariffs. Now, to say that was a direct response to the stock market crash at the beginning of the Depression is not exactly fair, because there was discussions around that going back into the early part of 1928. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act passed in 1930, so it had already been discussed, but finally gained enough support after the stock market crash in 29 that it finally passed, and it basically raised tariffs across the board to a pretty significant level, and ended up triggering what is probably the most recent example we have of a broad-scale trade war. And so what you saw was between 1929 and 1932, global trade basically cut in half, actually a little bit more than cut in half. It went from about my numbers may not be exactly right, but 5.8 billion to like 2.3 billion or something like that in just a very short time frame, less than 5 years,
which were bigger dollars back then.
Yeah, so percentage wise, that's pretty, obviously pretty significant. Imagining what that would look like now is just hard to wrap your mind around in terms of the scale of what that would be now. And there's a lot of reasons that the overall environment is a little more stable than it was back then. One of the things that was a real driver there was partially in response to some of these protectionist measures from the U.S., the Great Britain decided to get off of the gold standard, and several other countries followed later, including us eventually. And obviously that had some big impacts, but we don't want to get too far off the topic here. But basically what happened there is you had a macroeconomic decline here in the U.S. that reverberated around the world. And the response was protectionism from the U.S. and then eventually a response from several other trading partners. And what really ultimately ended up coming out of that was a massive reduction in global trade, a deglobalization. And so, that's a really good historical argument for kind of where we're at right now. We may be seeing in response to some of these tariffs and some of this protectionism responses globally that could result in a continuation of the deglobalization that we've already been experiencing for the last half decade.
We've not deglobalization the last half decade. Someone's going to say, well, I'm not sure I believe that. I wouldn't say it's happened here. The calls for it have really, Trump began this during his first term, 2018, 2019, didn't get a lot of support. He did keep talking about the evils of China, or as he calls it, China. Remarkable how he says that. Anyway, but we're seeing it now. And the thing is, what I guess what a lot of folks should probably realize, look at first off, the saber rattling, the visceral response from Mexico and Canada's leadership, but then also behind their posturing, you see some countries that are honestly shook up. When you're a country of 40 million to our north, you're 1/8 the size of the United States. Your economy is connected at the hip to the United States. And they obviously have had a pretty good situation in Canada. Mexico's got an ascending economy, 130 million people, so a little more than 1/3 of the population of the United States, just south of our border. Their rise is absolutely 80% of it is chalked up to because of the United States growth. When you are next to a country that's got 4% of the global population with 25% of the global economy, meaning that's our country here in the United States, Mexico gets an exponential gain because of that. So it's not them that are screaming for trade wars and tariffs and protectionism, because they've been a net beneficiary of globalization, particularly with Asia. Asia's growing economy has helped them sell their goods, and then also the United States of America. It's wealthy countries that are starting to look at a decline that clamor for trade war or tariff or protectionist government policy, to be clear.
Yeah, and so, we saw that back in the 30s as well. One of the responses from Great Britain, in addition to leaving the gold standard, was to actually form a trade bloc with the former Commonwealth countries, including Canada, which really had a major impact on reducing trade between the U.S. and Canada, and also between Great Britain and Europe. And you saw, several other examples there too. It's always sensitive to bring up Germany and during that time period, but they had what they called the Reichsmark bloc that was really focused on, again, kind of forming alliances with ideologically and regionally, I guess geographically friendly countries, and so I think that's probably what we're going to see here again. Obviously, right now we're in the early days and getting mixed signals, I think, from the administration in a lot of different ways. But I think probably most likely where this ends up is more of a regionalization. So instead of having a lot of multilateral trade between the U.S. and China and Brazil and China, you're going to start to see that kind of consolidate with less trade between these blocks and more trade within those blocks. But overall, I think the reduction in global trade is probably going to be fairly significant.
So another reason when I can make the case that our tariffs and trade wars and protectionism are going to become the new normal, first off, we've already said when population begins to decline, and then economic expansion, which was always predicated on that population growth, globally our economy is expanding by, let's call it a couple percent. I mean, it's not great. China tries to say they're at 5%, and they jailed one of their economists who came to Washington D.C. in December and publicly said, yeah, it's more like 2%. He went home and didn't get heard from for a while because the Chinese Communist Party does not want anybody to know that they're actually only growing their economy by about 2%. Here we're talking 2 to 2.5. So anyway, let's just say it's 2%. That's good. That justifies still, making more slinkies and hula hoops and growing more corn or whatever. The problem is our productive capacity is growing by greater than our economic expansion. And that's where then there's calls for. It's the same old thing as obviously we're in the business of agriculture, but it doesn't matter if you're making electric vehicles or soybeans. When you're growing, your productive capacity grows by 5 to 10% a year, and consumption is at best growing by 1 or 2% a year, there's a glut. When there's a glut, then you say, crap, you know what we need to do? We don't want to stop producing soybeans or electric vehicles. Let's just protect what we have. And that's, again, where there's this response. Knee-jerk, maybe even defying economics, because tariffs are kind of like minimum wage or rent ceilings, rent floors. They try to distort the true equilibrium price point of what supply and demand would create.
Yeah, and I think we probably need to distinguish here in terms of tariffs. I think we need to distinguish between, short-term targeted tariffs that are used as a sort of a negotiation tool, a diplomatic negotiation tool, a political tool, if you will.
So also sometimes used as a slap on the wrist. You know what?
Yeah, for sure.
We know that you came in and swooped in and threw trillions of dollars at Nippon Steel, and then the result was you're dumping Japanese steel all over the globe for half the price of production. So by God, we're going to tariff the hell out of you. That's been one of the other reasons was whoever the arbiter of discipline is, but we've oftentimes seen it that way, I guess, as another reason for it.
Right. And so, in that context, I think that's a lot different than what we're sort of alluding to, which what it appears to be developing is this is much more of a policy position of the Trump administration. Now, that's not anywhere close to a settled issue. I think there's a lot of question marks around what that ends up looking like. But to the extent that it does become more of a standardized policy issue, then I think the things we've been talking about become exponentially more likely to occur.
Well, we gave the reasons why we think trade spats, trade wars, tariffs are going to be a thing globally, because we're not talking about just the United States. I mean, and I got listeners that are from all over the world, and that's great. A lot of Canadians and Australians, people in Europe. Because one thing, first off, when it happens one place, there's always the response. It's kind of like the physics. It is always met with an equal and opposing reaction. Every action is, and that's one thing for sure. The other part of it is politically, and we're not going to get off on a political thing here. We're recording this in mid-March 2025. I'm not sure that it's not tariff for tariff's sake here with the Trump situation. Almost like that's why I can see it having long-term effect. You say, well, the next politician will come in when he's gone and reverse this. I'm not sure. Once something gets in place, companies learn to work around it, work with it, circumvent it. Those that are benefiting from it, Todd, try and get rid of ethanol tomorrow. And you say, well, a different administration will come in and get rid of it. Look at the billions of dollars of infrastructure that now is built up because of it. Well, what if trade restrictions create the same sort of infusion of capital? Then the business models get set. It's hard to unwind that.
Yeah, it really is. And I think it's even harder now than it would have been in the past. We talk about, a lot of people that are supportive of tariffs as a policy, as a standardized policy, will go back and say, well, back before the U.S. had an income tax, they funded the federal government primarily through tariffs. And that's true, but that was a much different world. That was a much less interconnected world. That was not a world where we were exporting a big chunk of our agricultural production, where we were importing a big chunk of our consumer needs. It was just, I think we got to be really careful drawing, conclusions. So historically, that's correct, but I think the context there is really, really lacking. It's way different. And so, to your point, deglobalization in the 1800s or deglobalizations in the 1930s is a different context than it is now, because we are coming off of, that ebbed and flowed, but what we're coming off of was sort of a hyper globalization,
Yep.
that started probably in the 70s or 80s with the opening up of China and some of the stuff that you've talked about during that time frame, and then ended, I would argue, probably a little bit prematurely due to the COVID pandemic and some of the supply chain disruptions there, where we haven't really quite come back from that.
So when we ask the question, are tariffs and trade wars and protectionist government policy the new normal, and then deglobalization, again, they are the same thing because they go hand in hand. And then you talked about, okay, then regional partnerships come up. USMCA is the exact example. It was the precursor to that was NAFTA, 1994 under President Bill Clinton. It was renegotiated under Trump term one, allegedly going to be renegotiated now. Again, we're recording this mid-March. By the time you're hearing this, maybe it will be renegotiated. I don't think it's going to be renegotiated by the time you're hearing this. But anyway, what usually happens, if you look at historically and economically, is countries then, when there's the threat, they prop up and protect the industries that have a loud voice in their countries, and then also you'll see it's almost, I hate to be mean, but it almost is a joke when, not being mean, I have a lot of Canadian listeners, but when Justin Trudeau said, well, if they tariff all of our stuff, then we'll tariff things that come to Canada from the United States, like playing cards. I'm like, holy shit, does he think that this is like a big economic, like, is this your bingo chip? Playing cards? What? So the tough part is, in France protects the hell out of French wine, a few things. And I heard a commentary. I've never been to France, but I heard a commentary person on some business publication that said, pretending that somehow the United States is evil for throwing tariffs on, go and try and order a Woodford Reserve or a Maker's Mark, any of the fine bourbons and whiskeys that we make in the U.S. South in France. Now, I've never been to France, and I don't drink hard booze, but I can tell you that when the commentary says, yeah, it's about 5 times what it would be here, and it's not just because of shipping. This has been going on for a while, and you'll see that countries tend to protect these little niche-y things that we aren't even aware of.
Well, we've got a great example right here in the U.S. with the sugar industry. The sugar industry has been very protectionist. They've done a fantastic job if you look at it from the perspective of the
politics,
the politics and the lobbying and that industry's accomplished. But I think sugar prices in the U.S., it's a pretty small part of people's expenses, but I think it's probably 2 or 3 times what it is in most of the rest of the world. So tariffs, protectionist policies as a matter of long-term policy are inflationary, and it's really hard to argue against that. To kind of go back and pull some of this stuff together. I made a list. If we go back looking at kind of wrap up this discussion around the 30s, what were the effects of the globalization crash that we saw in the 30s?
By the way, if you're going to do that, then I want you to bring it forward, and you're going to say, "Would we see a similar thing today?" And of course,
Well,
as you said, 1930s world looks a hell of a lot different than 2025 world. So I want to do that real quickly. I got to get another commercial here for Redox. You know what? If I have to pay more for stuff because of tariffs, I have to make money. So therefore, I've got to tell you about my sponsor, Redox. The new year brings hope for improved outcomes on your farm. One way to achieve that is through the high-tech plant nutrition provided by Redox Bionutrients. Redox is a family-owned company in business since 1994. They're headquartered in Burley, Idaho. I was just there in February. Awesome people. Got a greenhouse. They got R&D. They got some really cool stuff going on about how to use bionutrients to help you maintain your plant charge balance. All nutrients have a positive or a negative charge. You can maintain your charge balance, and that will allow your plants to focus on yield and quality with improved performance come harvest time. You can find out more. You can find out how to get this product on your farming operation. Go to redoxgrows.com. Redoxgrows.com. 1930s. Smoot Hawley. What were the implications?
So the effects of the globalization crash that happened in the 30s that I came up with five. One was we've already talked about a little bit, was global trade declined by half. That disproportionately affected countries that relied heavily on exports, like Argentina, Canada, Australia, and then the economic slump that kind of began earlier in the decade only continued or deepened, I guess. Number two was a collapse of agriculture prices. It really resulted in overproduction and price crashes in grain, cotton, coffee. There was all kinds of those commodities where they crashed, and you ended up with a lot of bankruptcies, farm bankruptcies.
Now, here's
in
what's
North
interesting,
America.
Todd. There's going to be somebody that brings it fast forward, and they say, "See, tariffs and trade do this." But here's the thing that's perplexing. It's not because the world stops eating. Yeah, we have trade and tariff disputes, but all of a sudden, this country doesn't go from eating agricultural products to then starving. What happens generally, if you use the 1980 grain embargo, which was a similar thing to it, it was certainly a trade war, and it was kind of like a tariff, but it was inverted. We stopped shipping food to Russia. The idea we were going to starve the Soviets. They just amped up their own production and found other places to supply them. So I think that you could make the similar case in the 1930s. The globe didn't stop eating. They just said, if there's going to be trade disputes, rather than just buying it from you, we'll fix our own supply or increase supplies from other countries. And so what happens usually in agriculture, you correct me if I'm wrong here, supply shoots up because of the uncertainty created by the trade disputes or the price point. It's kind of like, oh, you're going to charge me that much? Screw it. I'll just figure out how to buy it somewhere else or make my own.
Yeah, and so you could make an argument that it'll be worse this time or better this time,
Yeah.
and I think both of them are somewhat reasonable. But I think when it comes to the fundamental oversupply or surplus that we have in food is significantly higher than it was in the 1930s. I didn't go back and look at those numbers. I probably should, but significantly higher. And so I think you could make an argument that it might be more impactful for exporting countries and less impactful for countries that are maybe more reliant on imports, less food insecure or less food secure, if you might
You think
put it that way.
They're the ones that are hurt the most initially, right?
And in the 30s, I think they were probably hurt pretty bad in terms of just a lack of sufficient supply, and then even those countries that we talked about that were net exporters were, their reliance on exports was much lower than in the 30s than it is now. I mean, relatively speaking, it was high, but compared to today, it's going to be extremely low. There's three other effects that I saw: increased self-sufficiency and economic isolation. That probably sounds a little familiar. And
Like
number
I just
four,
said, if like I just said, if it looks like you're going to be under threat of not being able to get the goods that you had formerly been getting because now you're in a trade dispute, you just say screw you. I'll ramp up my own supply or figure it out, and that's what happens there.
well, and
And
you're certainly seeing, one of the things that you heard was the discussion back in the 30s around self-sufficiency. That's a mantra that's becoming more and more common. You're hearing it out of China now. You're hearing it in a lot of Eastern Asian countries around the world, really. So
by the
that's a
way, Todd,
reflection.
we're also hearing a little bit here. When did we start hearing this? When supply chain. The average American never even used the word, heard the word, or understood the word supply chain. And when did we start hearing it? The whole COVID shutdown 20. So in the last 5 years, there started being calls for, holy crap, I didn't know that all of our chips were made in China. So what do we have happening within 20 miles of where I'm sitting right here in my Arizona house? There's an Intel facility that looks like a small city being built on the way to Tucson, and a Taiwan semiconductor chips facility being built about 15 miles to my north that looks like a small city. Self-sufficiency isn't just because of tariff and trade dispute. It became unavailability or China keeping us over a barrel and using supply chain and COVID as a reason. Same exact thing.
Yep, exactly. Four was a shift from liberalism to state-controlled economies. We saw that, in a fascist shift in some parts of the world, in a communist shift in other parts of the world, but a pretty marked shift in the 30s away from free market capitalism. So that's probably not great news.
No,
And then the last one is
but going from 30s to now, never in your lifetime, or mine, you're a little younger than me, did you hear that vast numbers of a population segment, and in this case, I'm talking about millennials to Gen Zs, if unless the polling is all bogus and made up, a vast number of them, I don't think it's a majority, but a vast number of them, according to the research that I've seen, believe that socialism is the key and that capitalism has failed. And that was never a thing. So this walks down the same aisle. A 30-year-old that believes that socialism is a superior economic mechanism to capitalism, they're walking down the same aisle as tariffs, trade restrictions, bigger state control. It's deglobalization. That's all protectionism. It's all right there.
Yeah, for sure. And so, obviously that's, we're starting to see signs of that transition. You see, the Bernie Sanders campaign, talking about, democratic socialism, one of my favorite oxymorons ever. And a discussion about UBI, about universal basic income, which has been ramped up with some of the discussions around AI and automation. So the last one was World War II. Really. And so World War II was in part, I mean, obviously there's a lot of factors that came into play there, but a lot of that was a response to some of the economic challenges that we saw in the 30s and the responses to those challenges. And so I think we need to be careful. I certainly don't think it's a destined to be the case this time as well. But I mean, it's really hard to think about that without thinking about the current situation in the Middle East, the current situation in Russia, Ukraine, the current potential situation between China and Taiwan. So, I think all five of those are at least, and again, we have to be really careful about drawing direct comparisons between the two. But, clearly there's some those historical rhymes that we talk about a lot.
Historical rhymes, Todd. If you know what, history repeats itself, or at least it plays the same song a lot of times. Trade cut by half. We might see that in the year 2025. Collapse of the ag markets. I'm not saying it's a collapse, but you know what? If you're in this game, you're seeing some increase of self-sufficiency. We already talked about it. That's exactly what's happening. We're not going to be dependent on chips anymore. Liberalism to state control. We just talked about maybe not my generation and yours, us proud Gen Xers, maybe not the boomers, but when you see that a vast number of these people that are younger believe that socialism is a better economic model than capitalism. And then obviously the capper there, World War. Nobody wants to see that, but we've got as much unrest. I can see a lot of comparisons here.
Yeah, I can too, and I hope that we take that historical context into consideration and consider that as we make decisions on how to move forward here.
All right, we're going to point out why we could be wrong. Todd and I like to do this as thinking individuals. Before we do that, I want to point out one thing. He brought up Bernie Sanders. As a guy that used to be a political comedian, and I watch politicians talk, I think he might be among the worst public speakers of any politician I've ever seen. He shakes his hand like this. He shakes his hand like he's patting you down and telling you to shut up. And it becomes almost like a nervous thing that he does while he's yelling about billionaires. The billionaires, the billionaires. He looks like an old man having a seizure. He truly does. Like an old man that can say one word, billionaire, billionaire, and shakes. It's quite remarkable. Anyway, why could we be wrong? Why might tariffs and trade, maybe this is a short-lived thing. By the time you're hearing this, you're like, Damian, you and Todd are such old news. That thing was it came and went. I don't think that's going to be the case at all. I think these things take a long time to unwind. They ramp up. They ramp up pretty quickly, and they go away way, way, way slowly. Why could we be wrong that tariffs and trade wars are not, and protectionism is not the new normal?
I think there's two things that jump out to me, and both of them seem relatively unlikely, but certainly plausible. The first one I alluded to earlier, and that is, maybe we find out that economic growth and population growth aren't quite as interconnected as we thought they were. Maybe that was a coincidence that they were highly correlated and not necessarily causative. I mean, we certainly don't know that for sure. So I think we have to at least question that, since we don't really have any way of knowing for sure, that those two things were correlated due to causal reasons.
There's the hope, and I don't even like to use the word hope, but there's the outlook that a stagnating population or even declining population can still create economic expansion because the fewer number of people live better. There is a case to be made for that, using the United States as an example. There are fewer humans per household than there have ever been historically in the United States, but our consumption is on a per capita basis is greater than it's ever been. So there is enough historical evidence to say a fewer number of people can still drive forward great economic expansion, because each of them goes from living in an average of 1,800 square feet to 2,800 square feet, which means you need more carpet and you need more sofas and you need more manufactured goods and you need more cars, whatever that should be.
Yeah, and I think there's definitely some case to be made for that. Most of the evidence I think would point towards, at least in the context of our current economic system, it's hard to see how that could be the case. Now, with some massive changes to our economic system, probably most of which are not particularly appealing to me as a free marketer. Maybe that could be different, but I think we have to at least acknowledge the possibility that maybe growth at a reasonable pace continues despite that population decline. So I think that's one fundamental issue that we need to think about. I think the other is, that the possibility that all of this discussion, all of these threats, end up driving key people to the negotiation table. And what comes out of this is a grand economic agreement between China and the U.S. that incorporates, obviously the two largest economies come together and create some sort of grand agreement on how we're going to reignite multilateral and bilateral trade between our two countries. Could have a major impact. If a grand deal with a new revised USMCA or NAFTA 3.0 or whatever you want to call it is the result of some of this saber rattling that we're seeing here in North America, maybe this moves in a different direction. I think that's probably not terribly likely, but certainly plausible, and maybe the ultimate goal of the administration. I think that's the biggest question right now, and maybe we get more clarification before this comes out and we end up looking a little foolish. But I think right now the big question is what is really the end game for the U.S. administration, and I don't know that anybody knows for sure what that is. possibly even including those in the administration themselves.
Maybe, but I want to point out, I'll give you another reason. First off, from the political standpoint, yeah, you can say, is this tariffs just for the sake of tariffs, or is there an end game here? I think the end game is an illustration of the power of the United States. When you are 25% of the global economy, we've been parasited. I mean, and I'm not getting political here, but we have been. Our nearest neighbors, Mexico and Canada, benefit greatly from the United States. So I can see where there's some call to action to reset those agreements. Europe has benefited greatly from the United States, particularly from our military backing and also our economic engine. And also, fine European goods end up here. And I can tell you that I'm not sure that a lot of American goods end up there. So I think there's that. I want to throw out one more reason why we could be wrong, why tariffs and trade wars and huge protectionism will not be the norm. The power of huge multinational corporations and the capital that backs them, i.e. BlackRock, and the four other huge investment entities that literally have more money than almost every country on earth, the BlackRock, the Blackstone, Vanguard, start naming them, the huge financial players. They are little governments into and unto themselves, Todd. And they also have a huge impact on our government because we live in a transactional political environment. If you have money and power, you can buy more power that then helps your money. I'm not being mean. I'm not being jaded and being truthful. For God's sakes, how stupid are you? Look at the banks. When the banks have problems, they get bailed out. Look at the airlines. The airlines play nice. The big car companies. We bailed them out. Why? Because they played nice to the government. They don't want trade wars and they don't want tariffs. That's why they haven't. That's why it's not been a reality in the United States. Again, but in other countries it has been. Siemens, or start naming large German companies, Mercedes, which is now Daimler, Chrysler, et cetera, et cetera. Those entities have made a pretty good bed for themselves. In the United States, they want there to be no restrictions because they want our capital to flow other places, but then those other countries where those multinational companies are want to protect what they have there. It's worked out very well, and you could say the multinational companies have been much of the reason why there was the protectionism in Europe or in even Canada, whatever.
Well, I think it's an excellent point, and I think one of the things we need to point out is we talk about this trade between Brazil and China, or between the U.S. and China, or the U.S. and Europe, or whoever it is.
Yeah.
Who's facilitating that trade? The reason that has become such an ingrained part of the global economy is because these big multinational companies are facilitating that trade. So I think you're exactly right. That is obviously well entrenched and very powerful, constituency to try to encourage continuation of the current global order without using it.
And you know what? Again, as an American, Todd, you can look at the good of it. It means that we've got access to a whole bunch of stuff. Go to the store. We got access, but you can also, as an American, see, without getting emotional, a little bit of the reason where, these huge multinational corporations, they want access to they want our money, but they don't want us to go and compete in their countries for their money. Trump said it. I just drove by a BMO, Bank of Montreal. There are Canadian banks in the United States of America. I work in Canada all the time. You know how many times I've seen a Wells Fargo or a Bank of America up there? None. So they protect their own banking sector while they send their banks to here. Again, on the car front, a lot of people didn't realize this. We got European automobiles here. How many American automobiles do you see on the road in Germany on a percentage basis?
Well, and we've got, this will show that this discussion wasn't scripted because I can't remember the name of one of the players here, but just this morning I heard about BlackRock. There's a company, Hong Kong-based company, that is wanting to sell the port operations, including the Panama Canal, to BlackRock.
Yeah.
So it'll be very interesting to see from a political perspective how that plays out. You've got, BlackRock, which is the epitome of what you're talking about in terms of an influential multinational organization.
With more money, truly, with more capital than all but like 3 countries.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. And at the same time, you've got a Hong Kong based company that is thinking about selling these assets to BlackRock. So it'll be very interesting to see whether the Chinese government decides to try to put their weight behind breaking that deal down. So that may be one indication of whether or not how likely your scenario that you described is. Does BlackRock end up buying that really important access to that infrastructure, or does the Chinese government successful in preventing that?
Yeah,
so that'll be really interesting to see.
I'll give you then. We just gave you some of the reasons why we could be wrong. Let's go back to reasons why we think we're right about tariffs, trade wars, protectionism being the new norm. Populism and protectionism go hand in hand. Again, these are things that walk hand in hand down the same aisle. Deglobalization, which is again. Globalization's only been a thing for the last 50 to 70 years. Trust me, your great-grandfather didn't. Yeah, they might have gotten something from a foreign country, but it was a big deal, right? In general. Populism seems to be popular. And the media, which media tends to be very globalist. The media tends to be very liberal, very lefty. So when you see that elections are happening in Europe and they say they're supporting right-wing candidates, that means they're going away from a globalist leadership, the same globalist leadership that has imported frankly, criminals from third world countries that has not been very popular in Sweden. So populism and protectionism really are attached at the hip, just like some of the other things I said. And there is a growth in populism in terms of which populism and nationalism kind of are the same thing. I want my national identity. I want my country to be my country again. And therefore, let's shut the border from foreigners. Let's shut the border from foreign imports. I don't need your damn Kentucky bourbon. I'll be just fine here in France without it. And that's, they're voting for Marie Le Pen. Now, the global order is trying to keep that from happening, but I think it's tough to restrict the masses for long.
Yeah, and I think we associate these populist movements with right-wing movements because they're challenging the elites, right? And in the last 75 years, the elites have been mostly a left-wing class of elites globally. Yeah. But that's not always the case. That's not necessarily the case. The first half of the 20th century, it was very much the other way around, where it was more of the what you would, and you always got to be careful with the right and left thing because it means something different, globally than it does here domestically.
But yeah, the general in 1917, when there was an uprising and that what became the Soviet Union, it was not against liberals. It was a socialist movement, which became a communist movement against hardcore right wing, rulers, brutal rulers, frankly, and very capitalist oriented. That's why they were so well off, czars.
Exactly. Right. So, obviously we have to be careful about some of the comparisons to the 1940s and some of that kind of stuff. But in terms of the centralization of power in different hands, that's certainly something that tends to be associated with protectionism and isolationism.
If you look at historically, the restrictive trade policy doesn't hurt the richest countries. And so all of this hand-wringing that's happening, there's more calls for trade restrictions and restrictive trade policy in countries that shouldn't be calling for it. You know what I mean? The United States, those other countries benefit greatly from globalization more than we have. You can say, but our companies did. Well, maybe, yeah, BlackRock did, or name the top 300 companies in the country. But in general, a wealthier country can withstand a trade dispute much better than obviously Venezuela. All they have to sell is oil, and if that gets shut off, then what do they have? Well, then they have in a hugely impoverished country, which is what they have.
Well, and I think and not to get too far into the politics of this, but I think that is one of the key factors that we have to keep in mind, that it's very difficult to come up with a scenario here that hurts the U.S. without hurting other countries even worse, right?
Yeah.
So it ends up being, and if you look at this whole thing from Canada's perspective or from China's perspective, and you think, okay, well, here's some things we could do to, leverage our side of the argument and inflict some economic pain on the U.S. Almost all of those
Restrict,
also
cause
inflict,
them, yeah.
even more pain on themselves, right?
Yeah,
So
you're
it's
going to inflict for every pound of pain you put on the United States, you're probably putting 2 pounds of pain on yourself, and that's why I said, is it saber rattling and haggling and negotiating and standing tough? And there's also, these are elected officials that tend to do the saber rattling, so that way they can ignite that nationalism. When the president of Mexico, Scheinbaum, is that her name, stood defiantly against, she got a whole lot of accolades. You've got a more machismo-oriented culture. She's a woman. She stood up to bad old orange man. That plays really damn well with her electorate. But if this thing moves forward 6 to 12 months from now, Mexico's pound of flesh they're taking from the United States cost them 10 pounds. And that's a real thing. And yeah, there's no question.
yeah, for sure. So yeah, I mean, in the long term, consequences of that, I think we need to take some time to consider that, because what we're talking about is, kind of short and medium term, and maybe, if there's enough anti-U.S. sentiment or whatever, it ends up driving some longer term changes that could be really bad for the U.S. economy, like the loss of the dollar as the reserve currency, or any number of those kind of situations that kind of create that scenario today. But certainly in the short to medium term, I think that's definitely true. And I guess as an American, you got to look at that and say, well, that's probably a net positive. But getting hurt less than your neighbors is not is kind of a negative way to view the world.
You always know that guy that was, and I've been in some mix-ups, and this probably surprise our listeners that I've actually been in some mix. Well, first off, I got 4 older brothers, so I learned how to fight dirty. Trust me, and I was littlest, but I always find it interesting, the person that like gets the shit beat out of them and tells you they won the fight. I'm like, yeah, it looks like you won. Yeah, I mean, you really won. Like you can't see out of your left eye, and you got broken hand, but you won. And I agree with you on that. You're mid 40s, I'm mid 50s. Let's say we both have another 10 to 20 years left of working in this industry, and since it's the business of agriculture, I think that we're going to look back and say, because you and I both have a thing about history, and then also looking forward and basing our beliefs on where things are going. I think we're going to look back and say this was the beginning of something that was already coming. COVID created the self-sufficiency idea, and it started to deglobalize anyhow. We started hearing the terms nearshoring and reshoring a few years ago before there was ever any talk about tariffs and trade spats. The trend toward nationalism, the trend toward populism. I think that the table was, I'm not saying set, I'm saying, let's say a lot of pieces were in place already. And I think that we're going to look back and say, yeah, it started about with the COVID timeframe, and here we are. And I think that when you and I are still in this 5 to 10 years from now, we're going to say, yep, Damian and Todd called it. There's more restrictive trade policy than there was for 30 plus years. And here we are.
I think that's very likely to be the case. I think, regardless, I am really struggling to come up with a scenario where 10 to 20 years from now, we don't look back on this time period as a period of massive transition, where we had, way more change in the next 10 to 20 years than we have in the last 50 to 100 years. That seems almost obvious to me at this point. Exactly what kind of change that will be, obviously, I have some ideas, but I don't know exactly what that's going to look like. But I think you're very likely right.
Yeah, well, the China juggernaut stops being quite as much of a juggernaut because they don't have the rapid growth. Again, global unrest, which seems like it goes in fits and starts, right? Where now we're all of a sudden, almost at war again, and we had times of peace, etc. So if you look at this, I think it's cyclical, and I think we're here. Last time we saw this call for this, really it was in the 80s, because we've been pretty hardcore globalized for the last 30 years. But also during that exact time, using Europe as the example, they were more protectionist and continue to be. And I think that we're going to start going down the same path.
Yep.
His name's Todd Thurman. If you want to learn more about him, you should keep up with him on LinkedIn. He has brilliant stuff. He puts out really good stuff. Just go to LinkedIn and type in Todd Thurman. That's Thur, like Thursday, man, Thurman, Todd Thurman. Go and check him out. He's got a company. What's your company again?
Swine Insights International.
He writes articles. He's on here. He's also my partner on the Business of Ag Success Group. If you want to get smarter and know what's going on and hear some really cool people, it's a network of ag professionals. We get together every other Friday on a Zoom call. It costs you $99 a month to be part of the group. There's no subscription, so you should check that out. You can do this. You can sign up at DamianMason.com. Todd's going to be going to China, so hopefully everything works out for that. He goes to China the way you might like get on a plane to go to Kansas City. So anyway, be good over there.
Will do.
Anyway, till next time, thanks for being here. Do support my friends. Remember, Newfields Ag, sponsor here of the show. Redox Bionutrients sponsor the show. And my new sponsor, Harvest Returns. Go to harvestreturns.com to check them out. Till next time, Todd, thanks for being here, my friend. It's a long one, but a very, very good one.
Thanks for having me.
Till next time, I'm Damian Mason, and this is The Business of Agriculture. Hey, sincere thanks for joining us here on another episode of The Business of Agriculture. I want to ask you, if you farm, are you looking for more productive efficiencies to grow higher yielding, better performing crops? Well, of course you are. Newfields Ag provides a complete portfolio of biological products focused on you, the farmer. If you want to learn more about the Newfields Ag product lineup, go to newfieldsag.com for information.